Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories. Here we tell slow and gentle tales from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin tonight's dreamy story. Hey guys, welcome back to another long, slow, mildly ridiculous drift through the past. Tonight, we're talking about the fork. Yes, that shiny little tool you probably used without thinking today. The one that somehow took 1,000 years to get from Byzantium to your kitchen drawer. So dim the lights. Get comfortable. Maybe you've got a snack nearby, ideally something fork-worthy. And let's just ease into the strange and surprisingly controversial history of one of humanity's least urgent inventions. Let's start in the beginning, the very distant beginning, where humans ate with their hands, because, of course, they did. Tools were for hunting and killing things, not for poking them politely at the dinner table. In fact, the entire concept of table manners would have made an early hunter-gatherer, assuming they had any breath left after chasing down dinner. The first people to get fancy with eating tools weren't Europeans at all. They were the ancients, Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans, and even then, their tools were mostly knives. Not the table kind, but sharp, battle-ready instruments that occasionally moonlighted as cutlery. Romans, for example, would recline at their banquets, tear food apart with their hands, and maybe use a small knife or spoon for scooping sauces. They weren't exactly neat about it. If you ever get the feeling Roman feasts sound decadent, imagine a room full of toga-wearing men lying sideways, belching over oysters, and arguing about poetry. It wasn't fine dining, it was chaos with furniture. And yes, there were a few early versions of forks around. Archaeologists have found two-pronged utensils in ancient Persia and Byzantium, mostly for cooking or serving. But here's the catch. Nobody considered them tableware. Stabbing your food before eating it was considered barbaric, which is ironic given the Romans' entire reputation. Now, the fork's real story, the sleepy, winding one, begins in the Byzantine Empire. Around the 7th or 8th century, the imperial court in Constantinople was the world's hotspot for glittering overcomplication. Everything had a ceremony, robes, icons, even bread. So, of course, some genius decided that delicate ladies of the court should not touch food with their divine fingers. Thus, the fork, except it wasn't our modern fork yet. It was a dainty two-pronged gold or silver object, more like a miniature pitchfork designed by a jeweler with too much time. High-ranking women, particularly in Byzantine aristocracy, started using them during formal meals, not because they were practical, but because they were performative. You know the type. The kind of person who'll pour milk into their tea just to look refined, even if they hate milk, anyway. One of the first recorded fork incidents involved a Byzantine princess named Theodora Duc, who married into the Venetian nobility around the 11th century. When she arrived in Venice, she brought her personal fork collection, which sounds normal today, but at the time, it was like bringing your own laser utensils to a medieval picnic. The local clergy was horrified. A priest actually preached a sermon about it, claiming her use of forks was an affront to God's natural order. Humans, he said, were given fingers by the Almighty, so using anything else to touch your food was basically culinary blasphemy. Theodora ignored them. And then, a few years later, she died young, which the priest immediately blamed on divine punishment for her sin of the fork. Yes, people really thought God was micromanaging dinner habits in 1004 AD. From there, The fork's reputation in Western Europe was pretty much ruined for the next few centuries. The Venetians thought it was too effeminate. The French thought it was too foreign, and the English didn't even have proper napkins yet. So forks were several centuries ahead of their vibe. Throughout the Middle Ages, dining in Europe remained gloriously medieval, which is to say, sticky. Meals were eaten off shared trenchers, basically stale bread plates, and everyone reached in with their fingers. You could wipe your hands on the tablecloth, on your neighbor, or on a conveniently located dog. Forks were unnecessary and therefore suspicious. When they did appear, it was usually among the very rich, and only for serving, not eating. Imagine a huge banquet table, candles everywhere, platters of meat, and one unlucky servant whose only job was to stab the roast with a golden fork so the Lord could cut himself a slice. That was peak sophistication, but, as always, Italy couldn't resist being fashionable. By the late 15th century, the Italian Renaissance was in full dramatic swing. Artists, architects, and poets were reimagining everything, including how one should look while chewing. Somewhere in Florence or Venice, the fork started to make a comeback as an accessory for the elite. Catherine de' Medici, who later became Queen of France, is often wrongly credited with bringing the fork to France in the 16th century. The truth is murkier. She didn't invent the idea, but she did popularize eating like a snob. Her court imported all sorts of Italian refinements, including elaborate etiquette that made French nobles feel like they were doing something cultured, even when they were just rearranging their soup. Still, most French diners thought forks were ridiculous. Even King Henry III of France, one of Europe's more fashion-obsessed monarchs, was mocked for using one. When guests saw him delicately picking at food with a fork instead of his fingers, they whispered about his vanity. A few even said he was unmanly. Apparently stabbing salad was a gender issue. Meanwhile, in England, the idea took even longer. The English were deeply proud of their ability to do things the hard way. When an English traveller named Thomas Coryat came back from Italy in 1608 and started using a fork at dinner, people literally laughed at him. They called him Furcifer, fork-bearer, and made fun of him in poetry. He, however, insisted that forks were more hygienic and practical, pointing out that they prevented one's fingers from becoming greasy. But this was the early 1600s. Most people didn't bathe regularly, so the hygiene argument was ahead of its time. By the 17th century, the fork had spread across parts of Europe, but still faced resistance. The Puritans disapproved because it was foreign, and foreign meant suspect. The clergy disapproved because it was indulgent, and the poor just didn't have time to care. They were too busy eating whatever wasn't moldy. Let's pause here for a second. You might be wondering, why did this take so long? Well, imagine you live in a world where 90% of meals are stews, porridges, or hunks of bread dipped in something. A fork isn't helpful for any of that. Spoons made sense. Knives made sense. Forks were, for most people, a luxury solution to a non-existent problem. Also, there's a weird cultural psychology at play. People hate being told they're doing something wrong, especially something they've always done. When forks appeared, they came attached to an attitude, import. Nobles looking down their noses at everyone else. So the common response was basically, "Oh, you think you're better than us? Fine, enjoy your little spikes. We'll be over here, eating like humans." Still, the fork persisted. Slowly, quietly, it made its way from Italian courts into France, Germany, and beyond. The 30 Years' War didn't help matters. Europe had bigger issues than etiquette, But by the mid-1600s, the idea of individual cutlery began to make sense in a more refined, plague-surviving kind of way. Dining became more private. Nobles hosted smaller, more controlled meals. Servants poured wine, wiped tables, and yes, laid out personal place settings. The fork started evolving, too, from 2 prongs to 3, then 4. Adapting to the European obsession with sauces and delicate morsels. By the 18th century, if you still ate with your hands in polite company, you might as well have shown up barefoot. The fork had gone from scandalous to standard. The irony, of course, is that it took nearly a millennium to normalize something that literally just makes eating less messy. Let's float gently into another corner of this strange history, the symbolic side. Because as with everything in aristocratic Europe, the fork wasn't just a tool. It was a signal in Renaissance courts. Everything at the table meant something. How you sat, which hand you used, how much you ate, even how you wiped your mouth. The fork became a miniature emblem of class. The poor might have spoons made of wood, but the rich flaunted silver forks with ornate handles, often engraved or gilded. Some were so elaborate they were practically jewelry. You weren't just eating dinner, you were performing it. Meanwhile, the church kept grumbling. Even centuries after Theodora's incident, religious leaders occasionally warned against vain instruments of pride. Because nothing says humility like finger food. But the battle was already lost. Once France embraced the fork and exported its influence across Europe, the rest of the continent followed, reluctantly but inevitably. By the time of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, table etiquette had become almost tyrannical. His court at Versailles set the model for European dining, with rigid seating orders, ceremonial serving, and of course, forks. The man who once banned pointy shoes and lace patterns he didn't approve of wasn't about to let people touch their mutton with bare hands. From there, the fork story becomes a quiet march of standardization. Designs improved. Metalwork spread. Industrialization made them cheaper. The middle class adopted them, and soon enough, even the taverns had a few lying around, usually bent, dull, and slightly sticky, but still forks nonetheless. Now, to be fair, not everyone in Europe was crawling toward the fork at the same pace. Italy had been showing off its delicate dining rituals for centuries, while England was still debating whether napkins were pretentious. It's easy to picture a 17th century English nobleman watching an Italian diplomat at dinner, baffled by the sight of him gently twirling noodles instead of inhaling them like a warrior returning from battle. And you just know he went home afterward, muttering about continental nonsense. But that's the funny thing about civilization. It creeps in, one utensil at a time. Let's linger in Italy for a bit longer, because this is where the fork found its soul, or at least its sense of purpose. Pasta, that's the real reason. Spaghetti, tagliatelle, fettuccine, all those long, slippery, noodle-based ambitions. Before forks, Italians had to eat pasta with a knife and a spoon, which worked about as well as you'd imagine. So, when the fork re-emerged in the late 1400s, it was suddenly the perfect tool for taming the chaos of boiled dough. By the 1500s, the Italian upper classes were using forks regularly. Goldsmiths and silversmiths competed to make the most elegant sets. And when Italian merchants traveled north, they carried their dining habits with them, along with their opera, their Renaissance art, and their casual superiority complex to the rest of Europe. Italy was basically the influencer of the 16th century. Everyone rolled their eyes, but everyone copied them eventually. France, as always, took the trend and added lace. Under Francis I and later Henry III, court life became a blur of perfumes, powdered faces, and enough etiquette rules to fill a small encyclopedia. A royal banquet wasn't just a meal, it was theatre. The king's posture mattered. The order of courses mattered. How you dabbed your lips mattered. And of course, the fork was now part of the script. Still, most people outside the court didn't bother. In the French countryside, peasants were still dunking bread into communal bowls, same as ever. They probably heard about forks in gossip or sermons, the way we hear about billionaires buying space tickets. Interesting, sure, but not something you'd ever need in real life. Across the Channel, England continued being England when Thomas Coryat came back from his Italian travels. Showing off his fork at taverns, people genuinely thought he'd lost his mind. One pamphlet mocked him for forsaking God's fingers. That phrase was actually printed. God's fingers. But Coryat was patient. He published a travel book praising the fork's elegance and cleanliness. Slowly, very slowly, the gentry started to experiment. Maybe they tried it privately at home, away from prying eyes. Like sneaking tofu into a barbecue by the Restoration era, after Charles II came back from exile in France. The fork finally started showing up in English dining rooms. Because if the king was using one, then it was automatically fine, maybe even fashionable. In Germany, things were a little weirder. Forks appeared there early, but in fits and starts. Some princely courts adopted them in the 1500s, while others refused. Martin Luther, the Reformation guy himself, thought forks were unnecessary, too delicate for real men. But then, a century later, Protestant burghers in cities like Nuremberg were polishing silverware like it was a badge of virtue. It was the usual European mix of contradiction, moral sermons on simplicity. Served next to a four-course meal that required 3 separate utensils. As we drift further into the 1600s, something subtle happens. Dining becomes slower, quieter, more individual. In medieval feasts, people shared everything. Meat, bread, sauces, germs, all part of the fun. But by the early modern period, that communal chaos started giving way to personal plates, separate cups, and assigned seats. Hygiene played a part, sure, but so did hierarchy. The fork fit perfectly into that shift. When you hold a fork, you're controlling a private portion of food. You're staking a tiny claim of ownership. No one else touches it. It's yours. That's a very modern idea. The same period saw the rise of private rooms, personal diaries, and locks on doors. The fork, humble as it is, belongs to that quiet revolution, the slow birth of the individual at the dinner table. Let's float back for a second to the church's disapproval. It's tempting to laugh at priests who condemned forks as sinful. But from their point of view, this wasn't just about tableware. It was about pride. The medieval Christian ideal valued humility, even at meals. Using something fancy to avoid touching food with your fingers looked suspiciously like vanity. Of course, these were the same clergy who dined off silver plates while preaching poverty. So, consistency wasn't their strong suit. Still, the fork's reputation was shaped by that moral tension. It was always slightly decadent, slightly unholy, which, ironically, only made it more appealing to the upper classes. Nothing says luxury like something priests hate. Meanwhile, outside Europe, The rest of the world looked on in mild confusion. In China, chopsticks had been around for nearly 3,000 years. Japan had refined them into an art form. Even Persia and the Ottoman Empire had specialized spoons and skewers for different dishes. Europe was, frankly, the late bloomer at the dinner table. It's as if the continent could conquer half the world, invent perspective painting, and compose symphonies, but couldn't figure out how to eat spaghetti without flinging it at the wall. By the time the 1700s rolled in, the fork was finally respectable. Silver manufacturers in England and France began producing matching sets, spoons, knives, and forks designed as trios. Dinner tables became status displays. The middle class copied the aristocracy, right down to the tablecloth folds. Forks grew an extra tine or two for different foods. A carving fork had 2 prongs, a dessert fork had 3, and a dinner fork usually had 4, because of course there needed to be rules. Nothing terrified Europeans more than the thought of eating with the wrong implement. Etiquette manuals appeared, explaining which hand to hold your fork in, when to put it down, how to signal you were finished. It was no longer just a tool, it was choreography. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The real charm of this story isn't the design evolution or the social signaling. It's the irony of how slow it all was. From Theodora's gilded 2-pronger to your average IKEA cutlery set. It took over 1,000 years for Europe to agree that poking food was acceptable. In that time, entire empires rose and fell. The printing press was invented. The telescope changed astronomy. People mapped the world, discovered new continents, and still argued about whether touching meat with your fingers was ungodly. If that's not peak human behavior, nothing is. Let's imagine one last scene before we drift toward the end of this part. It's 1750. Somewhere in Paris, candlelight glows across a mahogany table. The host, a minor noble with powdered hair and questionable finances, has laid out his silverware like a tiny army. A servant refills wine glasses in total silence. Conversation murmurs about Voltaire, the price of sugar, maybe the scandal of some duchess's new lover. Everyone's sitting perfectly upright. Nobody slouches. Forks glide gently from plate to mouth, polished and deliberate. No one dares lick their fingers. No one dares slur. The fork has finally done it, tamed Europe's appetite into etiquette, and yet, if you watch closely, you'll see someone, maybe the host himself, sneak a little piece of bread into his fingers when he thinks no one's looking. Because old habits die hard, and because, deep down, we never really stop eating with our hands. We just dress it up in silver. Let's linger for a few quiet minutes in the twilight of the 18th century. That strange in-between era when Europe was half powdered wig, half industrial smoke by now. The fork had made itself at home. It sat on every aristocratic table, shining beside the knife and spoon like a member of the family nobody liked but couldn't live without. But that doesn't mean everyone agreed on how to use it. The French held it in the left hand, prongs down, with a sort of stubborn grace. The English insisted on switching it to the right hand after cutting, because apparently the left hand couldn't be trusted to feed anyone. The Germans preferred efficiency, knife in one hand, fork in the other, minimal nonsense. Each nation quietly decided its way was the civilized one, and everyone else was doing it wrong. That's Europe for you, of course. Etiquette teachers took this small difference and turned it into an entire philosophy. By the late 1700s, manuals explained that your fork grip revealed your class and moral fiber. Holding it the wrong way wasn't just uncouth, it was a sign of spiritual decay. And so, something that started as a shiny little stick for eating noodles became a battlefield of subtle snobbery. That's the quiet comedy of civilization. Every practical idea eventually becomes a moral statement. Meanwhile, down the social ladder, ordinary people were catching up. Forks were no longer reserved for aristocrats. Blacksmiths and tinkers were producing simple iron or pewter versions. The middle class, eager to imitate refinement, began setting tables with them. Even when the meal was just stew and bread, it's easy to picture a family in a small English town, proudly unpacking their new forks, trying to copy the motions they'd seen in paintings or at the manor house. Awkward, a little clumsy, but determined. The sound of metal on ceramic slowly replaced the old wet slap of fingers on trenchers. Progress, one awkward scrape at a time, and in the countryside, peasants still ate the way they always had, hands, spoons, and shared bowls. But even there, the fork had begun to whisper its way into the imagination. Something new, something genteel, something that made dinner feel like part of the modern world. So, by the dawn of the 19th century, Europe was finally united on one small, improbable front. Everyone, rich or poor, noble or not, was beginning to poke their food before eating it. It had taken 1,000 years of suspicion, sermons, scandals, and slow adoption, but the fork had arrived. And maybe that's the real charm of this whole story. It's not about innovation or necessity. It's about how humans resist change, even when it makes life slightly easier. We cling to habits like old furniture, insisting they're fine, until one day we look around and realize we've all moved on without noticing. If you could step back through time, walk quietly through those centuries of dining rooms, castles, taverns, and dim candlelit halls, you'd hear the evolution in sound at first, the wet rustle of fingers tearing bread, then knives scraping platters, then spoons clinking bowls, and finally the gentle, civilized tapping of a fork against porcelain, the heartbeat of polite society, each sound a little cleaner, a little quieter, a little more distant from the messy reality of eating. By the 1700s, Europe had reached that self-satisfied stage of civilization where people started writing books about how to sit, chew, and breathe properly. The Age of Enlightenment, they called it, a time of philosophy, science, and deeply serious debates about table posture. The fork, by now, had gone from scandal to standard. It wasn't new anymore, but it was newly important. Because as people started believing in reason and refinement, they needed a physical way to prove they were reasonable and refined. The dinner table became their stage. Let's start in Paris, because of course we do. Paris in the 18th century was the capital of manners. Every movement, every gesture had a rule. Servants learned the choreography of dinner the way dancers learn a ballet. A fork wasn't just for food. It was for social survival. If you ever wondered how many ways there are to hold a fork, 18th century French manuals would happily tell you there were dozens. The right hand, the left hand, tines up or tines down, depending on what was on your plate and who was watching. The goal was to look effortless, which meant practicing endlessly, because nothing says sophistication like spending an hour rehearsing how to eat a pea. Dining at this time wasn't about satisfying hunger. It was about performing civility. People sat upright, spoke softly, and discussed art or politics while pretending not to notice the servants sweating behind them. The fork had become a prop in a social play about being human, but slightly better. Even philosophers joined in. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wrote endlessly about natural living, still followed strict dining etiquette in public. Voltaire used forks engraved with his initials, naturally. The same men who questioned monarchies couldn't bring themselves to question dinnerware. The age of reason, it turns out, had limits now. Let's drift to London, the smoky, coffee-fueled capital of gossip and empire. English dining rooms were more restrained than French ones, but no less ritualized. Forks had fully taken hold here too, especially among the rising middle class. Merchants, bankers, and colonial officers were determined to prove they were as genteel as any duke. That meant forks, matching tablecloths, and enough silver polish to blind a small dog. There was even a moral angle to it. Politeness became a virtue, a visible sign of inner discipline. Holding your fork correctly showed not just good breeding, but good character. It meant you were civilized enough to control your impulses, even the one that said, "Just grab the chicken leg." The irony, of course, was that all this refinement was funded by a global empire built on trade, conquest, and sugar plantations. But at least the forks were shiny. Speaking of sugar, that's where colonialism quietly enters the story. By the 18th century, European diets had changed dramatically thanks to the Atlantic trade. New foods were pouring in from across the world. Tea from China, coffee from Arabia, chocolate from the Americas, spices from everywhere. Suddenly, dinner tables needed new utensils, new rituals, new reasons to feel superior. The fork fit neatly into that transformation. It was the perfect companion to exotic delicacies. Eating tropical fruits or delicate pastries with your fingers was unthinkable. A fork, polished and poised, made every imported indulgence seem respectable in a strange way. Global exploitation had given Europe not just wealth, but a new kind of etiquette, one that needed tools to match its ambitions. Now, not everyone was thrilled about this march toward refinement. Writers and moralists worried that table manners were replacing moral manners. They warned that people were becoming too focused on appearances, too obsessed with rules. One English preacher complained that a Christian ought to dine with humility, not ceremony. He was ignored, mostly because it's hard to feel humble when your soup course arrives in gold-trimmed porcelain. Still, there was a faint unease underneath the elegance. The more polished dinner became, the more artificial it felt. By the late 1700s, even some nobles began to miss the old simplicity, or at least liked to say they did, while still using forks shaped like swans. Let's drift over to Vienna for a moment, the quiet, powdered heart of Central Europe. If France gave the fork its elegance and England gave it its practicality, Austria gave it its precision. At the Habsburg court, everything was timed, measured, and catalogued. Dinner could last for hours, but every course had a schedule. Forks came in specific sizes and shapes. One for fish, one for meat, one for dessert. The royal kitchens kept entire inventories of silver, numbered, polished, and guarded like treasure. It's hard to imagine anyone actually enjoying the food with that level of pressure. But enjoyment wasn't the point. Control was. The fork had become a symbol of order, the empire's miniature mirror of hierarchy and restraint. You could rebel in politics, maybe even in art, but at the table, you behaved. The 18th century also brought one of the fork's most charming transformations, specialization. Before a fork was a fork. Now, every dish demanded its own. There were pastry forks, pickle forks, oyster forks, and fish forks, each slightly different, each claiming to make dining more efficient. It's a beautiful irony. The more rational society claimed to be, the more ridiculous its utensils became. Imagine explaining to a medieval peasant that you need 3 separate forks for one meal. They'd probably assume you were performing a ritual to appease a god of metal by now. The fork had also started its slow voyage outside Europe. Colonial officers brought them to India, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean, often insisting that local elites adopt European manners. Missionaries, traders, and bureaucrats all carried forks in their luggage. Little metal ambassadors of civilization. Of course, in many places, locals politely ignored the idea. Why switch from chopsticks, fingers, or spoons, methods perfected over centuries, to a foreign tool that made rice fall off the tines? Still, in port cities and colonial courts, forks began to appear at diplomatic dinners, sitting awkwardly beside indigenous dishes that had never asked for them. That's the story of the fork. In miniature, a thing that traveled not because it was needed, but because it represented power. Let's pause for a moment and picture the world around 1780 in Paris. Noblemen twirled their forks beside flickering candelabras. In London, merchants eat boiled beef with sterling silver. In Calcutta, colonial officers sweat through their uniforms while insisting on European table service. And somewhere in a small English village, a family unwraps their first set of forks, marveling at how heavy they feel, like owning a piece of the modern world. It's the same sound everywhere now, metal touching porcelain. Civilization condensed into a tiny clang. The Enlightenment prided itself on clarity and progress. The fork fit that mood perfectly, sleek, symmetrical, rational. A tidy little triumph over chaos. It didn't change the world in any grand way, but it made dinner quieter, cleaner, and a little less human. Maybe that's what progress always does. The Enlightenment fork wasn't about utility anymore. It was about identity. It told you where you stood, what you knew, and how much of the world you could afford to own. And for all its elegance, it also carried a quiet shadow. The story of the hands that mined the silver, shipped the sugar, or served the table. That part never made it into the etiquette manuals. So as the century closed, revolutions brewing, empires stretching, the fork remained in its steady, glittering place. Empires might fall, kings might lose their heads, but dinner would stay civilized. Even during the French Revolution, etiquette barely flinched. Forks still appeared at the tables of the new republic, as if they could outlast monarchy itself. You could guillotine a king, but heaven forbid you touch your bread with bare fingers. That's how deeply the ritual had sunk in, not just into manners, but into the imagination. The late 1700s were an age of contradiction. People preached liberty and equality while dining behind walls of silver and etiquette. The fork sat quietly at every table, its polished tines catching the light of 1,000 candles, reflecting both elegance and hypocrisy. By then, dinner had become a mirror of society. Every rule at the table echoed a rule outside it. You didn't interrupt. You didn't reach. You didn't rush. You waited your turn. You used your fork properly. And in doing so, you learned to play your part in a world that prized order above all else. Children were drilled in manners from a young age. Manuals told parents to correct how their sons cut meat or how their daughters held a napkin. Good breeding was no longer about blood alone, it was about behavior. You could climb the social ladder if you learned the choreography. A fork was your ticket upward. That's what made it powerful. There's something almost tragic about it. A tool meant to make eating easier had become a symbol of restraint, a constant reminder to hide your instincts. To eat with your hands was vulgar. To enjoy food too visibly was uncouth. Emotion had to be disguised as grace. The Enlightenment had taught people how to think freely, but not how to eat freely. Still, amid all the control and ceremony, there was a kind of beauty to the soft glint of silver, the rhythm of conversation, the strange comfort of predictability. In a chaotic world, dinner offered order. For a few hours, the world seemed polite, intelligent, civilized, even if it was just an illusion. And so, the fork sat there, steady, small, and strangely powerful. It outlived kings, crossed oceans, and shaped the rhythm of human behavior. A century earlier, people mocked it. Now, no one questioned it. The transformation was complete by the dawn of the 19th century. The fork wasn't a luxury anymore. It was a necessity. You could forget your prayers, but not your tableware. Even the poorest homes began to dream of owning one, not because it helped them eat better, but because it made them look like they belonged to the modern world. The fork had become the emblem of civilization itself. And yet, if you listen closely, there's still a faint echo underneath all that refinement, the sound of what was lost, the warmth of shared plates, the touch of bread in the hand, the messy joy of eating without fear of being judged, all replaced by a cool piece of metal that told you how to behave. Progress, it seems, always asks for a little piece of humanity in exchange. By the early 1800s, the fork had finally lost its mystery. It was no longer a conversation piece or a moral battleground. It was just part of the furniture. You didn't think about it anymore. You just reached for it. The same way you reached for air or a cup of tea. That's when you know an invention has truly won. Factories began to take notice. Metal workers who once hammered out ornate silver pieces for the rich now produced rows of simple, sturdy forks for the growing middle class. Birmingham, Sheffield, Solingen cities that once forged swords and armor were now busy arming people for dinner. There's some poetic symmetry in that. Europe laid down its weapons and picked up its cutlery. Progress, one tine at a time. The fork's design also started to settle. 4 prongs became the standard, slightly curved, perfect for scooping, spearing, and looking respectable. Earlier versions had been awkward, 2 tines that bent food more than they held it, or 3 that felt unsure of their purpose. But now it all clicked. The perfect balance of form and function. Elegant enough for nobility, practical enough for factory workers. And because the Victorians couldn't resist cataloguing everything, entire manuals appeared to explain which fork went with what. One for fish, one for dessert, one for salad, one for things nobody could pronounce. If you ever felt inferior while eating, that was the point. The upper class wanted dining to feel like an exam you were destined to fail. Travelers noticed the differences. An Englishman dining in Paris might fumble through 12 courses, sweating politely under a mountain of silverware. Meanwhile, a French diner in London might be horrified by the bluntness of British manners. The fork, it turned out, had regional dialects. The same object, slightly different accents. But beyond the fuss, something quiet and universal was happening. Across Europe, people were starting to eat the same way. It didn't matter whether you were in Madrid or Vienna, you'd likely hold your fork in the left hand, your knife in the right, and pretend you weren't hungry until it was socially acceptable to look at your food. Civilization, at last, had rhythm. It wasn't about efficiency, it was about belonging. And belonging mattered. Factories were growing, cities swelling, social classes shifting. For a new kind of urban middle class, the fork became a badge of legitimacy. A polished table, matching plates, a set of cutlery. These were signs that you'd made it out of survival and into aspiration. You couldn't always afford fine clothes or servants, but you could buy a fork that looked like one owned by a duke. A little piece of pretend gentility. That's the thing about progress. It always comes with an element of make-believe by mid-century. Every general store from London to Warsaw sold cheap, machine-made forks, nickel-plated, smooth, anonymous. They lacked the personality of handcrafted silver, but made up for it with accessibility. Anyone could join the ritual now. Dinner was democratized. Of course, the elites didn't like that. When the poor started using forks, the rich moved on. Two subtler forms of snobbery, napkin folds, wine etiquette, the precise angle of a wrist when cutting a roast. Anything to stay one step ahead. It's almost funny. The fork had started as a symbol of exclusivity, then became a symbol of order, and now it was just normal. The ultimate fate of every luxury, becoming boring, but boring can be peaceful. It means the battle's over. The fork had won. If you picture a dinner table in 1850, you can see all of this in miniature. A small lamp glowing on a lace tablecloth, the slow tick of a clock in the corner. A family sitting down after a long day of factory smoke and city noise. The father cutting meat carefully, the mother pouring tea, the children learning to hold their forks properly. No drama, no scandal, just the quiet rhythm of civilization at rest. And that's the quiet triumph of the Enlightenment fork. It didn't conquer through brilliance or invention. It conquered through habit. By the time anyone noticed, it was too ordinary to question. By the late 18th and early 19th century, the fork had quietly completed its European conquest. It had survived centuries of suspicion, mockery, and moral panic. It had traveled from gilded palaces to modest homes, crossing oceans and social classes. And it had done all this without a single battle. What makes this so quietly impressive is that it wasn't even necessary. Forks didn't make food taste better, they didn't improve health, and they didn't prevent wars. Yet, by sheer persistence and symbolic power, they reshaped behavior across an entire continent. In every country that embraced it, the fork brought order to chaos. It encouraged patience, courtesy, and a subtle hierarchy. By controlling the act of eating, society reinforced its rules, subtly and relentlessly. The fork became a silent instructor of civility, and yet, underneath the gleaming tines, there was always a trace of absurdity. Humans had spent centuries debating the morality of a piece of metal. Priests had preached, philosophers had shrugged, children had been scolded, and nobles had practiced their grips, all for a tool that simply helps move food from plate to mouth. It's almost poetic, really. Civilization in miniature. Progress framed by etiquette. Humanity softened by ritual. So, as the 18th century faded, the fork settled into its quiet triumph. It no longer needed to shock, no longer needed to symbolize refinement. It simply existed, accepted, unremarkable, and yet revolutionary in the subtlest way possible. And that's where we'll leave it for now. Imagine a candlelit room, somewhere in 1800 Europe. The chatter is soft, the silverware glints faintly, and the world outside is on the cusp of industrial transformation. The fork sits in the hand of a quiet observer, a tool of routine, a relic of centuries-long fashion, and a harbinger of a world where even the simplest acts would soon be mass-produced, standardized, and catalogued. Tomorrow, it will travel faster, reach further, and find itself in homes and cities that had never dreamed of etiquette manuals. The stage is set for the industrial age, so breathe slowly, let the sound of metal meeting porcelain fade. The Enlightenment fork has done its work. It has taught patience, order, and the strange, enduring power of tiny, quiet innovations. Sleep now. The next chapter begins soon, and it is a little louder, a little faster, and a little more mechanized. Hey again. If you're still awake, welcome back to the quiet, slightly obsessive world of history through tableware. Tonight, we step into the 19th century, where the fork goes from an emblem of refinement to a tool of mass society, polished, standardized, and utterly relentless. The Industrial Revolution was, among many things, a revolution of efficiency. Steam engines, railways, textile mills, factories, the world sped up. And yet, somehow, dinner remained its own slow, deliberate rhythm. In fact, the fork was perfectly suited to this new era. Why? Because the fork is simple, reproducible, standardized, perfect for mass production. Let's picture Birmingham, England, around 1820. Smoke rises from hundreds of small workshops. Metalworkers hammer, mold, and polish cutlery, producing dozens of identical forks per day. Gone are the ornate, one-of-a-kind pieces for nobility. Now, every rising middle-class family can own a set, nickel-plated, slightly heavy, unadorned, efficient, and practical. The democratization of forks mirrors the broader social shifts. Families moved from countryside farms into cities, living in smaller, tighter quarters. Private tables replaced long, shared boards. Meals became quicker but more individual, and forks, uniform and reliable, fit neatly into that new rhythm. It's the first time the average person could truly perform civility. You didn't need a title or a palace, just a fork, a plate, and the ability to follow a few simple rules. And rules, of course, multiplied. The Victorian obsession with order took table etiquette to levels that Enlightenment could only dream of. Which hand holds the fork? Check. Which time points down? Check. When to cut, when to stab, when to rest. Check. Which fork for which course? Check, check, and check. You could literally spend an entire meal just moving your fork around in the correct pattern, all while appearing calm and polite. This wasn't just dining. It was discipline made tactile. Factories made forks in bulk, but social pressure made every bite a performance. Children were trained meticulously. Mothers drilled the daughters. Fathers drilled the sons. Etiquette books illustrated with diagrams, showing tiny arrows for the angle of each tine. Sometimes, the guides included moral commentary. Sloppy eating equals sloppy character. And of course, the fork became a sign of industrial modernity. It wasn't just silver or steel. It was progress in miniature. Owning forks showed you were part of the new world, literate, orderly, and civilized. No matter how cramped your apartment or grimy your boots. Meanwhile, Europe's expanding colonial empires ensured the fork traveled far beyond its home. Officers, traders, and missionaries carried their utensils to distant lands. In India, the Caribbean, Africa, and Southeast Asia, forks appeared at formal dinners, alongside plates of unfamiliar foods. Some locals adopted them, some ignored them. The fork didn't care. It moved steadily forward. Indifferent to debate, it became a global symbol of the European ideal, neat, controlled, civilized. A tiny piece of metal representing 1,000 social hierarchies. The industrial age also brought the first factory-made fork etiquette sets. Imagine a box containing a dinner fork, desert fork, fish fork, salad fork, each labeled with instructions. Some even came with illustrated pamphlets explaining proper hand positioning and posture. Manufacturers were not just selling utensils. They were selling propriety, a packaged lifestyle, a ticket to social acceptance. The fork, once a scandalous novelty, had become a tool for conformity. And the irony. Everyone seemed perfectly happy to accept it. Let's take a quiet moment to consider the sound of dinner in the mid-19th century. A family in Manchester. Children sit stiffly, trying to remember which fork to use. The mother refills tea, her own fork resting on the edge of a plate. The father cuts meat slowly, making sure the knife and fork don't cross improperly. A servant whispers quietly in the corner. Outside, factories rumble, trains whistle, and the city hums with the pulse of industry. Inside, the table is still calm and rich. Civilization in miniature. The fork is no longer luxury, scandal, or fashion. It is routine, order made tangible. And yet, as always, there is an undercurrent of absurdity. Despite all the manuals, all the rules, all the industrial precision, humans are still human. Soup spills. Children stab awkwardly. Guests drop forks. The shiny tool meant to perfect behavior cannot change our instincts. It can only guide them. In fact, that tension between control and chaos is part of the fork's charm. It's a silent witness to progress, quietly judging every bite. By the late 19th century, the fork was everywhere. Modest homes, grand dining rooms, colonial outposts, and city apartments. Railways allowed dinner sets to travel across Europe quickly. Mail-order catalogues offered matching utensils to anyone with a few shillings. Factories churned out identical tines by the thousands. Everyone could play the ritual game of civility, no matter their social origin. And with that, the fork had fully transitioned from elite novelty to industrial necessity. It had survived scandal, superstition, social upheaval, and now it was simply indispensable. By mid-19th century, urbanization was changing everything. Cities like Manchester, London, Paris, and Berlin were swelling with factory workers, clerks, and small merchants. Homes became smaller, kitchens tighter, and meals more regimented. The fork, mass-produced and reliable, fit perfectly into this new rhythm. It didn't require skill or flair, just the willingness to follow rules. No longer a novelty for nobles, the fork had become a practical instrument of civility. But civility, in the industrial age, had a precise, almost mechanical feel. Eating became a form of rehearsal for life in the modern world, timed, controlled, and orderly. Families taught children to cut, spear, and scoop without haste. Every clink of metal on porcelain reinforced a sense of discipline. Let's linger in a typical Victorian dining room for a moment. The table is narrow, polished. Candles flicker faintly, casting shadows across plates and bowls. The mother refills tea, her own fork resting lightly on her plate's edge. The father carves the roast carefully, ensuring that knife and fork never meet incorrectly. Children follow along, occasionally glancing at illustrated etiquette manuals that show the proper angles, grips, and gestures. Outside the city hums. Steam engines factory whistles blow. Smoke curls into the sky. But inside, the rhythm is deliberate, human, and almost meditative. Civilization in miniature, distilled into silver and cutlery. Factory production made forks uniform, simple, and durable. Nickel-plated, stainless, or plain iron, they were cheap enough for middle-class households, sturdy enough for daily use. Gone were the gold-tipped or ornate designs of aristocratic tables. Precision replaced luxury, and with mass production came specialization. Different forks for meat, fish, dessert, salad, even oysters. The industrial age fork was not just a tool, but a guide. It told you how to behave, what to expect, and which foods required which motions. Following the fork's guidance became a mark of belonging in a rapidly modernizing society. Social class, of course, still mattered, even with mass-produced utensils. Middle-class families used forks to signal aspiration. They might not own a carriage or a piano, but a polished fork set could demonstrate refinement. The ritual of the table, repeated daily, became a subtle rehearsal of civility, hierarchy, and taste. Meanwhile, the elite moved on to subtler forms of distinction. Cutlery made from exotic metals, intricate table settings, specialized glassware. The fork had democratized itself. In doing so, it forced the upper class to innovate new ways to assert status. Colonial expansion continued to extend the fork's reach. European officers and traders carried cutlery across oceans, introducing it to distant lands. In India, Africa, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia, the fork appeared at formal dinners, often awkwardly paired with local cuisine. Some locals adopted the utensil. Others ignored it entirely. The fork moved steadily forward, indifferent to resistance, a silent ambassador of European social ideals. It was, in a way, a very patient form of cultural imperialism. Not violent, not flashy, just insistent. By the late 19th century, dining guides proliferated. Illustrated books showed the correct positioning of fork and knife, the right order of courses, and even the socially acceptable way to rest your utensils between bites. Eating had become choreography, discipline, and ritual combined. The fork had become an instrument not just of utility, but of moral education. Sloppy eating reflected sloppy character, and yet humans remained imperfect students. Soup spilled. Children jabbed awkwardly. Guests dropped forks. The tension between instinct and instruction remained, quietly humorous to any observer with patience. Railways and mass communication spread these standards across the continent. A family in Berlin could receive cutlery from a London manufacturer, along with a pamphlet outlining English table manners. Standardization bridged distance, creating a shared language of eating. The fork, in this sense, became a symbol of modernity, rational, predictable, and universal. It is almost poetic. The same tool that once scandalized Italy, England, and France now silently dictated behavior across an entire continent, connecting homes, cities, and empires through the quiet act of dining. By the turn of the 20th century, the fork had done more than survive. It had conquered taste, habit, and expectation. It had transitioned from elite novelty to middle-class necessity, traveled across oceans, and taught entire populations the rhythms of polite society. It had survived centuries of moral panic, aristocratic whim, and social upheaval. And it had done all of this quietly, invisibly, with a glint of silver that spoke louder than words. Let's pause here for a moment. Imagine a mid-19th century dinner table, children learning the proper grip, parents enforcing manners with gentle authority, forks glinting softly under gaslight, steam engines and factories humming beyond the windows. Order, discipline, routine, civilization distilled into the clink of utensils on porcelain. The fork, once scandalous, once laughed at, now guides humanity subtly, persistently and universally, and somewhere in the hum of machines and the chatter of dining rooms, the next chapter of its story is quietly taking shape. Global expansion, cultural fusion, and the dawn of modern cuisine. As the 19th century progressed, the fork's presence in daily life became so natural that most people scarcely noticed it. Once a scandalous curiosity, now it was simply part of the rhythm of civilized eating. Morning, noon, and evening, it guided the hands of city dwellers and villagers alike. Its shape, weight, and balance were so standardized that any fork from Birmingham or Sheffield could be swapped seamlessly into a Parisian dining set without a single glance from the hostess. Yet, beneath this ordinariness, there was a quiet power. The fork dictated behavior. It taught patience. It enforced subtle hierarchies. It shaped etiquette. Children learned to sit up straight, keep elbows off the table, and move in accordance with invisible rules. Adults measured their manners by how gracefully they held it. In a rapidly industrializing society, it was the most efficient way to rehearse discipline, control, and civility without saying a word. Factories churned out forks by the thousands. Metal workers, once crafting ornate silverware for nobles, now produced simple, durable, and uniform designs for the growing middle class. Nickel-plated iron or simple steel, it didn't matter. Each fork was a small triumph of industrial efficiency, a token of modernity that anyone could afford. Even as the fork became ubiquitous, specialized designs proliferated. Fish forks, desert forks, salad forks, oyster forks. The industrial age demanded precision and categorization. Each fork, labeled and often illustrated in manuals, told its user not just what to eat, but how to behave while eating. Eating had become a rehearsal of social order, and the fork was the instructor. Social mobility played its part, too. Middle-class families displayed their cutlery as a statement of aspiration. A polished fork set on a simple table could signify refinement, even if the household lacked wealth or status. The act of following etiquette was now a mark of belonging in industrial society. And, as always, the upper class found new ways to distinguish themselves. Elaborate designs, rare metals, and elaborate table settings that went far beyond the fork itself. This democratization of utensils quietly reshaped society. Eating properly was no longer confined to the aristocracy. Manners became a shared language, connecting urban centers across Europe. And yet, despite the standardization, the absurdity remained. Soup spilled. Children jabbed awkwardly. Guests fumbled. The fork could guide behavior, but it could not erase human nature. Meanwhile, colonial expansion carried the fork across oceans. Officers, traders, and missionaries introduced European dining standards to India, the Caribbean, Africa, and Southeast Asia. In some regions, locals adopted the utensil. In others, it was ignored or adapted. Either way, the fork moved forward, persistent and indifferent, becoming a quiet symbol of European influence and aspiration. Railways and postal services, further spread its use. Families in remote towns could purchase factory-made cutlery through catalogues, bringing uniformity and modern manners to homes that had once relied on simple spoons, knives, or even fingers. The fork had become universal, unifying disparate regions through the quiet rituals of eating. By the late 19th century, the fork had not just survived industrialization, it had thrived. It had moved from aristocratic novelty to middle-class necessity, crossed continents, and embedded itself in daily life. Its influence was subtle but pervasive. Civilization, in miniature, had been distilled into a small piece of metal, and yet, for all its utility and symbolism, the fork retained its quiet humor. After centuries of moral panic, etiquette, and social instruction, it remained just a fork. It could teach manners, convey status, and unite continents, but it could not stop a child from dropping it, or a guest from stabbing the tablecloth. It was human in the most mundane and persistent way. Imagine, now a city apartment in 1880s London or Paris. The family sits down for dinner. Children hold forks awkwardly, guided by the gentle authority of parents. The silver glints under lamplight. Steam from boiling vegetables curls into the air. Outside, factories hum, carriages clatter, and the modern world rushes by. Inside, the table is still. Order and ritual prevail. The fork moves silently, guiding behavior, enforcing manners, shaping civilization one bite at a time. And somewhere in the quiet, you can hear the faint echo of its centuries-long journey. From scandalized Italian courts to the bustling industrial dining rooms of Europe, the industrial age has embraced it. Mass production, standardization, etiquette, and global reach have ensured that this simple tool will remain indispensable for generations to come. By the 1880s and 1890s, the fork was fully normalized. It no longer shocked, scandalized, or signaled aristocratic pretension. It was simply part of the daily routine, quietly shaping behavior in homes, schools, and restaurants. Children grew up learning to hold it correctly, as naturally as they learned to tie their shoes. Families performed meals as rituals, guided by silent metal instructors that ensured civility with every bite. Yet, the fork's pervasiveness did not erase the absurdity of social expectation. Etiquette manuals grew ever more detailed. Which fork to use for fish, dessert, or salad. How to rest your utensils between bites. The angle at which to hold the tines. Even the pace of eating was prescribed. Not too fast, not too slow, always moderate, always composed. Missing a step was a minor social failure, and still humans were messy. Soup spilled. Carrots slipped off tines. Guests jabbed at plates. Children pretended to understand the rules while secretly gnawing on bread with their fingers. The fork could teach manners, but it could not erase nature. Factories had fully industrialized production. Sheffield, Birmingham, and other metalworking cities churned out forks in millions. Nickel-plated, steel, iron, inexpensive, uniform, reliable. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the fork from a symbol of elite refinement into a mass-market tool. Middle-class households could afford sets identical to those once reserved for dukes. Owning a fork now signaled order, modernity, and belonging. Even if the home had no other luxury, and as forks multiplied, they became standardized, not just in shape and size, but in function. Dinner forks, dessert forks, fish forks, salad forks, and specialty utensils for oysters, shellfish, and pastries appeared. Factory manuals and illustrated catalogues explained their use, bringing subtle uniformity to dining tables across Europe and eventually the wider world. Colonialism accelerated the fork's global journey. European administrators, traders, and missionaries carried utensils to India, the Caribbean, Africa, and Southeast Asia. In some cases, locals adopted the fork. In others, it was left aside in favor of traditional methods. Either way, the fork's presence was a quiet assertion of European cultural norms, a small yet persistent symbol of influence. Railways and postal systems further accelerated distribution. Families in remote towns could order mass-produced cutlery from catalogues, receiving identical utensils to those in city apartments. Civilization, it seemed, could now travel in a box, delivered by train, guided by instruction manuals, and enforced by polite expectation. Let's picture a Victorian dining room in a working-class neighborhood. A small table, polished but modest. The mother sets the plates. The father carves a joint of meat, careful not to let knife and fork meet improperly. Children hold their utensils with studied precision, occasionally glancing at the manuals pinned to the wall. Steam rises from a pot of vegetables. Outside, the city hums with factories, carriages, and railway whistles. Inside, the world is orderly. The fork moves rhythmically, guiding hands, enforcing manners, shaping civility in miniature. Every bite, a rehearsal of social discipline. Every meal, a quiet meditation on control, refinement, and routine. By the close of the 19th century, the fork had achieved a quiet triumph. It was no longer luxury, scandal, or elite symbolism. It was a universal tool, practical, instructive, and democratic. It had survived centuries of suspicion, moral panic, aristocratic whim, and social upheaval, and it had done so with the patient persistence of a small, gleaming teacher. And yet, it retained its quiet humor. Children dropped it. Guests jabbed it awkwardly. Soup slipped. Its instructions could guide, but never perfect. Civilization could be disciplined, but not entirely tamed. As the 20th century approached, the fork was poised for a new phase. It would meet industrial mass culture, global cuisine, and modern household standards. It would become more than European civilization. It would become global, ordinary, and utterly indispensable. By the end of the 19th century, the fork had fully transformed. What began as a scandalous curiosity in medieval Italy had quietly conquered Europe. It was no longer a luxury, a symbol of refinement, or a topic of moral debate. It was ordinary, reliable, and essential, a small, shining instrument of routine. Factories had made it uniform and affordable. Railways and postal systems had distributed it to every corner of Europe. Mass-produced cutlery ensured that a family in Manchester, a household in Vienna, or a home in a quiet provincial town could all share the same standard of dining discipline. The fork had democratized civility, yet it retained its subtle lessons. Its shape guided hands, its weight instructed posture, its presence demanded patience and decorum. Children learned manners, adults rehearsed composure, and every meal became a quiet exercise in social order. Civilization distilled into 4 gleaming tines. Even as it became universal, the fork's quiet absurdity remained. Soup spilled. Carrots slipped off tines. Guests jabbed awkwardly. Etiquette manuals proliferated, but human nature persisted. Civilization could be taught, guided, and nudged, but never perfected. The fork had also begun its global journey. Colonial officers, missionaries, and traders carried it to distant lands. In India, the Caribbean, Africa, and Southeast Asia, the utensil arrived alongside European ideals of civility, order, and progress. Sometimes adopted, sometimes ignored, it nonetheless left a trace, a small, persistent symbol of European influence and the spread of industrial modernity. In short, the fork had evolved from scandal to refinement, from elite ornament to mass-produced tool, and from local curiosity to global presence. Its journey through the industrial age illustrates a quiet truth. The smallest objects can carry the weight of civilization, habit, and cultural aspiration. So, let's leave the fork here for a moment, resting beside a dinner plate in a late 19th century home. The table is polished. Candles glow softly. Children hold their forks obediently. The city outside hums with factories, trains, and the relentless march of progress. Inside the fork enforces rhythm, patience, and etiquette. Outside, the world races ahead. And somewhere in that quiet, glinting silver, you can see the future. The fork will travel further, faster, and wider in the century to come, accompanying new cuisines, new cultures, and new manners. Sleep slowly. The industrial age fork has done its work. It has shaped hands, guided behavior, and quietly unified countenance.